It's a big honor to me to introduce today Gerd Mühlheußer. Gerd Mühlheußer is a full professor of the Department of Economics of the University of Hamburg since 12 years now. Before that, he was an associate professor in Bielefeld for 3 years, and before that, another 5 years, assistant professor in Bern. Gerd Mühlheußer's general research areas is applied microeconomics in several subfields like economics of the digital age, economics of contracts, industrial organizations, personal and organizational economics, law and economics, behavioral economics, economics in sports, and environmental economics. Here in this round, in this circle, in the Adam Smith seminar, Gerd Mühlheußer is well known because he already gave a lecture in November 2021, a little bit more than a year ago. And this was on moral transgression by groups, guilt sharing, and its underlying motives. And as we learned back then, guilt sharing has a lot to do with shared responsibility. Why am I mentioning that? Because from my gut feeling, with that, we are already more or less in the middle of the topic of today, because today's topic Gerd is giving a lecture on is autonomous vehicles, moral dilemma on adoption incentives. And what is it about today? Before I go a little bit into what it is about today, I have to mention, that's what Gerd asked me for, that Eberhard Fees is the one he was writing this paper together. It's a working paper still. And Eberhard Fees is from Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. And it's exactly the same story as last time. They do the paper together, but the talk is given by Gerd Mühlheußer because we let Eberhard sleep in New Zealand. It's deep night at the moment. So if it's fine for you, Gerd Mühlheußer gives the talk. And now what's today's paper about? So today's paper deals with the question of whether an automatism of autonomous driving, when preventing an accident, and let's assume an accident which is not preventable anymore, just to prevent harm and to reduce harm in decision-making, while that's the automatism, if this should give the protection of occupants a higher priority than that of other road users. That's a moral topic here. And on the one hand, everyone agrees that autonomous vehicles should maximize the general protection of all road users through their behavior, the behavior of the autonomous vehicles. After all, one promises safer roads through autonomous vehicles than today with natural drivers. That's clear. But on the other hand, that's the conflict now, autonomous vehicles that, in case of doubt, put the protection of the occupants behind the protection of several others, for example, even more others also that might be harmed, they will not be bought by individuals. Yes, this is the adoption problem. The paper deals with a degree of individual occupant protection that the automation should be equipped with, so that both the acceptance of the fleet of autonomous vehicles as a whole in society, on the one hand, and the acceptance of the vehicle as an individual vehicle by its owner, on the other hand, leads to an optimal level of safety on the road. We will see if we will talk something about equilibrias or what the game theoretical thinkings are, but this is the conflict of the paper of today. So what does this, the moral dilemma of autonomous vehicles, have to do with the shared responsibility, I call that? So, well, if the degree of morality is considered here with which the automatic system of weighting up the risk to third parties and its own occupants to be equipped, yeah, then this corresponds to the assumption of responsibility by a natural driver when he is in the comparable situation, when he can spare third parties by endangering himself. This is exactly the same. So we are talking about today the assumption of responsibility through automatisms, and thus ultimately about the division of responsibility between all drivers who no longer want to drive themselves, but take part in road traffic with autonomous vehicles. That's now my personal view. I have no clue if Gerd shared that, but I actually wonder if the first paper from November 21 on shared responsibility may be applied in some way to the moral dilemma of autonomous vehicles. I'm not sure. I don't think it's already happened, but we will see. And even more, I'm really looking now forward to today's lecture in order to see if and how the moral dilemma of autonomous vehicles is solved. So, Gerd, The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gregor, for the kind introduction. And thank you very much, Manfred, for inviting me again to give a talk in this group. I have very fond memories about my first talk a few months ago. Gregor had mentioned it. I was very happy to come back, basically. And I have something which I hope you find interesting. Gregor already mentioned some of the basic ingredients. I'm not sure, Gregor, whether I can fully respond to the questions you raised at the end, but maybe we can see how far I can accommodate your request. So let me maybe just share my screen. Okay, so as Gregor has already said, this is a joint paper with Eberhard Fees, who is a long-time co-author of mine. So we have written many papers together, and so we came together on that project. And just to give you maybe a little bit of background, so actually I was in the fortunate position to be on leave for a whole year to work in a research group, which was basically funded by I don't know whether you know, the Center of Interdisciplinary Research at the University of Bielefeld, the ZIF. And together with two colleagues, Herbert David from Bielefeld, who is also an economist, and Sabine Kless, who is a legal scholar from the University of Basel, we basically had time and resources to gather a nice group of people and to work on a number of projects in the area around smart products. So the research group was called Economic and Legal Challenges in the Advent of Smart Products. And one of the prime applications we looked at is autonomous or highly automated vehicles. So that is an important application of these new technologies coming or being developed, and people have many hopes for these technologies. That a lot of research a lot of resources going into the development on these products, and we have worked on some projects. So the one I'm presenting today is basically a project which we have started while the group was running. And so as Gregor has already mentioned, so the context of this paper is basically highly automated or even fully autonomous vehicles. I will call them AVs throughout. So this is hailed by many as a major innovation. And apart from a number of possible benefits, many claim that fully developed AVs, they will have the potential to fundamentally change mobility in societies. And one key benefit here is that they have the potential of being safer than human travel vehicles. So safer probably will not mean for the time being that there will be no accidents whatsoever, but the idea would be that maybe the occurrence of accidents can be reduced if these products are working as many think they could work eventually. And so we are not engineers, so I cannot judge how realistic this is, when these products in a full autonomous version will be available on the market. But I can tell you that there's a lot of research on these issues. And as an economist, one angle which I think we can bring in, and I have been working on a few projects by now, is the question concerning the adoption, right? So after all, it is the case that these vehicles, when they are there, someone must be willing to buy them. Someone must be willing to use them. And the question how quickly these IVs will basically penetrate the market once they are there, that will depend how much consumers like them. Yeah, and there's a lot of empirical research where survey studies ask people about their attitudes towards AVs, and the upshot is, well, there's a number of issues which people raise here, and there's a huge heterogeneity of individuals, how happy they would be or how ready they would be to adopt such a product. Yeah. And in this paper, we focus on one particular aspect of this idea of AV dissemination, and that is the question of how an AV behaves in a moral dilemma situation. So this is a case which has been studied in the literature, and it's basically framed as there will be situations, there will be unavoidable accidents where basically a decision needs to be taken whether the AV should behave in a way to protect the passengers, yeah, or in a way to protect third parties like pedestrians who occur on the street. Yeah? And many in the literature, and I will not go into that field too far, but just to give you a keyword here, many have connected this idea of this decision which has to be made by a car in unavoidable accidents to the well-known trolley problem in philosophy. And just to give you an illustration, so I don't know whether you have heard about this internet platform called Moral Machine, which is run by a few colleagues who I will be citing or mentioning in a second. Basically, they have set up an online tool and have conducted various experiments on that platform. They have collected millions of responses, and they basically frame this as a decision for here, for example, if the AV goes straight, then basically it will harm the pedestrians on the street. Yeah, or if the AV swerves, then the pedestrians will not be harmed, but the passengers of the AV will be harmed. Yeah, and so that is the dilemma situation we will be basically talking about. So it will be a decision: if you go straight, you will harm third parties. If you swerve, then the passengers of the AV will be harmed. And so what the starting point of this project was that we read an article by Bonfort and others in Science, a very influential paper, who found or who had a very interesting result. Yeah, it was about the question: how should AVs behave? Yeah, in such unavoidable accidents. And one important result in the study was that most people, they prefer AVs to be utilitarian, in the sense that they should behave as to minimize total harm. So in other words, if the decision is to harm one passenger, thereby saving two pedestrians from any harm, then most people would say, yes, the AV should sacrifice, or doesn't have to be life or death, we could just talk about harm levels, should harm the passenger and save the two pedestrians. So that is one thing. So that one thing I found interesting is that people seem to have preferences in line with what we could call utilitarian. But on the other hand, and that is basically a result in the same paper, is that people also think that this is the way how AVs should be regulated. Yeah, but they for themselves, they would be not so much willing to have such an AV which behaves in a utilitarian way, but they would rather prefer an AV which prioritizes the passengers. Yeah, and so in Bonfort and his co-authors, so they basically call this a social dilemma. So people say, well, AVs should be utilitarian and people should use these AVs, but I, for myself, I'm actually not so happy. I'm not willing to buy such an AV. Yeah. And so what we set out for in this paper is basically to analyze it's a purely empirical paper, and we are basically trying to analyze the resulting trade-off for a utilitarian regulator. And because we believe that this is can nicely be framed as a trade-off between ex ante efficiency and ex post efficiency. Yeah. So what is the ex post efficiency aspect here is that AVs should protect third parties whenever their harm exceeds that of the AV passenger. Yeah, so we try to minimize the social harm exposed. Yeah, but on the other hand, that might hamper the adoption of the safer AV technology, and that is the ex ante perspective. Yeah, and we basically try to combine these two perspectives in one modeling framework, and then to see how the equilibrium here looks like, and to conduct some comparative statics analysis, and to derive some maybe interesting results. So in a nutshell, we will have a very simple model where we have a utilitarian regulator who basically sets the level of driver protection of the AV, so how much the driver or the passenger in an AV is supposed to be protected. You will see this in a second, how this is exactly modeled. And there are different types of drivers who differ with respect to how much they value the AV, and they have to decide whether or not to adopt the AV or to stick with a human-driven car. So as I said before, I think this is really an important question, this adoption decision. So I've got to know a few people now from this transportation research community, and they say the big topic is really what is called mixed traffic. Yeah, so even if AVs will be available soon, we will have a long period, maybe a very long period, where we will have a coexistence of AVs, HVs, and other human road users. So that is, I think, really an interesting part. And with respect to the adoption of AVs, consumers have a choice. Yeah, and of course, this depends on many variables, and you will see we will be very, very parsimonious with respect to which variables we consider here in our framework. But of course, this is not to say that other variables will not be interesting. Yeah. So there's there's a few strands of literature to which we relate. So there's this discussion about how relevant this all is and how strongly related it is to the trolley problem. There are some philosophers who don't take it as easy in terms of seeing the similarity. They point to important differences, but that is not so important for our approach here. There's a large empirical literature coming up with findings concerning the strong heterogeneity of people when it comes to their attitudes and their willingness towards adopting AVs. We will be making that privately optimal adoption decisions might be different from socially optimal decisions. So in this respect, also in the vehicle sector, you might know this paper by Anderson and Aufhammer in the Review of Economic Studies, where they talk about SUVs. And I have another project in this area with Herbert David, where we talk about investment incentives, and also here we look at socially and privately optimal market penetration of AVs. And as you will see, we will have a simple game theoretic approach here. So in this respect, we contribute to a quite large literature in transportation research, which looks at game theoretical analysis in AV, HV, or other road users interactions. Yeah? So, for example, typical yielding situations, so two cars approaching a crossing, and then the question is who will yield. And if you know the AV will always be very conservative, then you might be more aggressive and so on. So this is the kind of literature. And also there's a literature with respect to liability. So that is also something which we will not consider in this paper. So I hope I will not disappoint you too strongly, Gregor, because I thought one of your comments went in that direction. Okay, so the model is extremely simple. Hopefully you say it's not too simple, so maybe we can discuss this. So we have basically two players. That's three players, sorry. Two of them are active and one is, at least in the main part, a passive player. So we will have a regulator who basically sets the programming of the AV. We have a driver, or which might be better called a consumer. I don't know whether it's the right terminology, hopefully not too confusing. So this person will decide which type of vehicle to use and other decision, a swerving decision to take depending on which car it chooses. And then we have a pedestrian, which is a passive party. So in the main model, the pedestrian does nothing. I will show you an extension where we will relax this assumption. We talk about two vehicles here, a human-driven vehicle, which we call an HV, so that is the kind of cars around these days, yeah, and we call an autonomous or highly automated vehicle, which I call the AV. So we have the case that both vehicles, they are prone to accidents. Yeah. So at the moment, I take this accident risk as exogenously given. I will relax that later on. So here in the baseline model, the accident probability is just some p between 0 and 1 for the HV, and p times 1 minus pi for the AV, and the parameter pi that measures the AV safety advantage. So the higher is the pi, the larger the safety advantage of the AV. Yeah, so you will see later on, this will be an important parameter which for our results. And if we are in a dangerous situation where there will be an accident, basically there's a decision by the vehicle can either go straight, yeah, and thereby basically harming strongly the pedestrian, or it can swerve, thereby harming strongly the driver. So that is not crucial that we have here these explicit numbers. So all we need is basically that the worst outcome for the driver is that is when he swerves and goes and drives into the wall, basically. Yeah. While the best outcome for the driver is when he does not swerve. So we normalize this to 0, but the idea is just that it is worse than hitting the wall, to make this an interesting conflict of interest between the driver and the pedestrian. And also we assume that if the vehicle swerves, then that is very good for the pedestrian, whose harm we normalize to 0 here, so that the vehicle hits the wall and the pedestrian is not harmed. And when the vehicle does not swerve, then the pedestrian suffers some harm h, yeah, which we take as a random variable ex ante, and we assume that this will be learned before the swerving decision. Yeah, so this is an assumption we are making. I don't think it is particularly restrictive. Maybe we can discuss this at the end. And so the question is, who takes the swerving decision? So if we are talking about an HV, a human-driven vehicle, so there the swerving decision is taken by the driver. Yeah, I will come to that in a second. On the other hand, the AV will swerve whenever the level of pedestrian harm exceeds a threshold H tilde. Yeah, so H tilde will be an important variable here, so that we will call the level of AV driver protection. And that is what is basically decided on by the regulator, and that is basically programmed into the AV. Yeah, so that is basically the decision rule for the AV. It gets a signal about the harm here, depending on what it does, and the decision rule is to basically gets a threshold. So if the harm is sufficiently high, the pedestrian harm, excuse me, is sufficiently high, then the AV will swerve, thereby sparing the pedestrian and thereby harming the passenger of the AV. Yeah, and so the higher, you can see that the higher the H tilde, yeah, the higher is the level of AV driver protection. So you can easily think of a high H tilde means a high level of AV driver protection. Yeah? So basically, if you have H tilde equal to infinity, that would mean the AV never swerves. Yeah, it fully protects the driver in all circumstances, while when H tilde is very small, then basically the AV always swerves and it always sacrifices the driver, basically. Yeah. We furthermore assume that the driver has social preferences, so it takes into account a part of the pedestrian harm, and we make this very easy. We basically say the driver puts some weight theta on the pedestrian harm. And the second assumption here is basically driven by the empirical evidence to capture this heterogeneity of people in order with respect to their willingness to adopt an AV. We assume that there are basically two types of driver, yeah, and they differ with respect to their adoption costs. Yeah, so the type here is the beta. We either have a low and a high type, and so the L type has low adoption cost and the H type has high adoption cost. So omega L we set equal to 0. That I think is without loss of generality. So we have then just this one parameter omega H. Yeah, and we assume that this is private information of the drivers, their type, and ex ante, the ex ante probabilities, they are commonly known. So alpha is the probability, ex ante probability for the low cost type, the low adoption cost type, and 1 minus alpha is the ex ante probability for the high adoption cost type. Yeah? And we have the regulator who basically sets the policy to minimize the total expected harm. Yeah? And so we have two types of efficiency here. The one is ex post efficiency. So when should a vehicle swerve? Well, if you have a utilitarian approach, you want to minimize the total harm, then you would say, if you go back to the table here, so if the vehicle swerves, the driver has a harm of 1, yeah, and so obviously you get an ex post efficient rule which says that the vehicle should swerve if the pedestrian harm for not swerving is larger than 1. Yeah, so this gives us an ex post efficient threshold for the swerving decision of the AV. It should swerve whenever the pedestrian harm is larger than 1. Yeah, and ex ante efficiency requires that both driver types should adopt the AV, and that is simply due to the safety advantage of the AV captured by this parameter pi. Yeah, and so you see, hopefully you see that here already, that we will probably have a trade-off here, namely if you set the level of driver protection to the exposed optimal level H tilde F, yeah, that might hamper the adoption of AVs, that might render the AV not very attractive for the driver, and therefore the driver might choose the HV, which is more prone to accidents than the AV, and therefore that leads to an inefficiency. Yeah? So that is the trade-off which our regulator is facing in this model. It's very simple. I leave it to you to decide whether it's too simple or whether we capture something interesting here. Concerning the timing of the game, so we have basically here 4 stages. So at the first stage, the regulator decides on the level of AV driver protection, which is then programmed into the AV. This is H tilde is the notation. At stage 2, and this is known, yeah, so the driver at stage 2 decides whether to purchase an AV or an HV and knows what the level of driver protection the AV has. At stage 3, there's the nature's move, basically determining whether or not we are having an accident, and the level of pedestrian harm, which that might be occur in case the vehicle does not swerve. And then at stage 4, the swerving decision is taken. So either by the driver in the HV, yeah, so it's the driver's decision to do that, or in the AV, it is the swerving decision occurs according to the threshold H tilde as determined by the regulator at stage 1. Yeah. So this is the timing of the game. So maybe that's a good time to pause and ask whether there are any questions concerning the model setup.
I have a question.
Yes.
You model this as at stage 2, that as the driver choosing to buy an HV, an AV vehicle, or going for another one, but obviously and it would be much more realistic and shouldn't make a difference if you just buy a car that is capable of having the automatic driving activated, but you are not compelled to use this part. You see what I mean? It can be a continuous decision either
Yeah.
that's a more realistic thing. I don't think it will really change anything on the
Yeah.
analysis.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I see your point. I mean, as we model it, we basically say you can either have it or you don't as it is, or you don't have it at all. And of course, in reality, you have more choices. Yeah.
Okay, fine. It was
But
just my
what we as you will see when I show you the payoffs is basically what you need is that you have, on the one hand, you benefit from the safer function, basically the safety function of this, letting the car decide. On the other hand, you keep discretion over the swerving decision. And if that is too far away from what you prefer, you would not activate it. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, I think it would not change our result. It would be a different framing, maybe more realistic. Thanks for the comment. I'll think about that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I do have a question. I don't know if there are
Yeah.
other hands risen, but I had a technical question on the slide before, on slide 8. I kind of didn't catch up. Why? So is this another prerequisite you put in, or why should this probability alpha of the low adoption cost type be 1 minus alpha times the probability of the high one? Is it just how you choose L and H, or why should alpha and 1 minus alpha be the two probabilities?
Oh, that is, I mean, I say, so in there, we want to have some heterogeneity. You could think of a population of consumers of measure 1, and alpha is then the share of those with low adoption cost, and 1 minus alpha is the share of those with high adoption cost.
Just the others. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. They have just to add up to 1 because we have only
Okay.
2 types. So to make this particularly
Okay.
simple. And so we didn't, I mean, it's formally equivalent to say we have just one driver and there are 2 possible types. But then if there are only 2 possible types, then they must add up to 1.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so then let's briefly go through the model. I will not at all formalize the formal stuff. Sorry, I will not emphasize the formal stuff, but I give you some payoffs and the notation, of course. So we solve the game backwards. So at stage 4, there's the swerving decision. And recall the assumption that at this point, you basically know, we assume you know the level of pedestrian harm. When not swerving, you know the level of driver harm when swerving. And so for the AV, the decision is clear. It swerves as programmed, right? So it will swerve whenever the level of pedestrian harm is larger than the given threshold H tilde. Yeah. And on the other hand, the driver in an HV, he basically compares the own harm of 1 when swerving compared to the internalized pedestrian harm theta H when not swerving. So recall theta was the weight which the driver gives on the harm of the pedestrian. So that was our measure of social preferences, if you want to call it like this. And so you see immediately that the driver in the HV will swerve whenever the harm of the pedestrian is larger than another threshold. It's not H tilde, but it's what we call H hat. That is just 1 over theta. Yeah, and also I think it makes sense. So we have assumed you care about others, but you care a little bit less about them than you care about yourself. And so this privately optimal swerving threshold for the driver, this H hat, exceeds the first best level. Yeah, so H tilde F. So the driver internalizes some of the harm of the pedestrian, but not 100% of it. And this leads to an inefficient degree of driver protection, basically, in the HV. Yeah? So that is, I think, is extremely simple, but captures maybe the gist of this argument. So at stage 3, recall that was a nature's move. So there's nothing to be analyzed in terms of game theoretic decision making. So we can right away move to stage 2, which is then here the adoption decision of the driver. And so you see, this is extremely simple. We have no costs, we have no prices and other things. So we just look at the behavior in these accidental situations and the adoption cost basically of the AV. So if the driver decides in favor of the HV, then this is basically the expected cost of driver type beta. So you see here P is the probability for the accident, and then you have this term. These are all realizations of H for which the driver will not swerve. So he will go straight, he will run over the pedestrian, he will harm the pedestrian, and he internalizes that damage with weight theta. And for the other cases, whenever the H is higher than his privately optimal swerving threshold H tilde, then he will not swerve and therefore have damage of 1. Yeah, so you see this is this swerving threshold we have discussed at the last slide. And 1, there's just a harm is 1 of the driver here. This was this normalization here. That here's 1. Yeah, so that is not really important. So all we need is that the driver is better off when not swerving, while the pedestrian is better off when swerving occurs. Yeah, and on the other hand, when choosing the AV, then the utility here is so the expected cost is type dependent. So again, you have this integral term here, which is basically the harm, the internalized harm from the swerving and not swerving decision. You have to take into account that the AV has a safety advantage. So the accidents occur with a smaller probability than with the HV, and you have this adoption cost omega of beta. Yeah, and so we get a very simple decision rule. We will say that type beta adopts the AV if and only if this difference here between the HV and the AV is non-negative. Yeah, so we resolve the difference in favor of the efficient thing, namely the purchase of the AV. Yeah. And so this is extremely simple. So we have basically a technical assumption here that this delta function is strictly concave over the relevant domain here. And the second assumption is that, to make things interesting, is of course if the car, the AV, provides 0 driver protection, yeah, then both types don't want to have it. So both types prefer the HV. Yeah, and on the other hand, the heterogeneity between the types is not so large that I cannot find the level of driver protection such that eventually both types will prefer the AV. But so if the types are somehow they say I will never use an AV, or the other says I will always use an AV, well, then there's no point. The adoption decisions are obviously not influenced by any policy choices. Yeah? So we want to basically limit attention to those cases where it can make a difference. Yeah? And so I think a lot of the story is built in now in this figure. So let me briefly illustrate that. So that for the vehicle choice, so this plots this delta function. So the delta is this difference between the cost of the HV and the AV. So it's basically saying if it is positive, you prefer the AV. If it is negative, you prefer the HV. Yeah. And so the first thing to notice here is that the low cost type has always a higher preference for the AV than the guy with high adoption costs. Okay, so that is maybe not so surprising, but still it's the case. Then both have the highest valuation for the AV when the AV exactly mimics the swerving behavior which they would take in an AV, because the swerving behavior they take in an AV is their preferred swerving choice. Yeah, and so if the AV does exactly that, yeah, that's what gives them the highest that makes the AV maximally attractive for each type. Yeah, so I should say also that I think I forgot this with the swerving decision. You see, in our model, the swerving decision is independent of the type. Yeah, and therefore they have both functions have their maximum here at this H hat level. Yeah. Then the third thing you could mention here is that there are thresholds here, H tilde H and H tilde L, yeah, such that the respective driver type is just indifferent between the two vehicles. Yeah. So and that must exist because I've of this assumption when the driver protection is close to 0, then both will prefer the AV, and when it is sufficiently large, then eventually they will prefer the AV, and therefore by continuity there must be an intersection where they are just indifferent. So that means that for any levels of AV driver protection larger than this threshold, the high cost type will adopt the AV, and for any level of driver protection larger than this level, the low cost type will prefer the AV. Yeah, and it makes of course sense that this threshold for the low cost type is smaller than the threshold for the high cost type, because the low cost type has a higher incentive for any given level of driver protection to adopt. Yeah, so in particular, if once we are above H tilde H, then both types will adopt. Yeah? If we are here in between, then the high type will not adopt, but the low type will adopt the AV. And if we are to the left, then none of the two types will adopt the AV. Yeah? And with respect to the comparative statics, it should also be clear that when the safety advantage of the AV increases, so when this was this pi here, you see how it enters here formally. So when this becomes bigger, then this makes the AV safer, accidents occur less likely, and that increases the attractiveness of the AV for both types. So both of these threshold values, they are decreasing in pi. Yeah. So the safer the AV, the easier it is basically to get these two types on board. Yeah. Okay, so this is basically the formal result. I don't go into details, but I think the intuition is clear. Now, let me move to stage 1. So now let's decide for the regulator, what is the second best optimal level of AV driver protection. Yeah, and so this from this picture here, it is clear that when you set the level of driver protection close to the ex post efficient level H tilde F, yeah, you can do that. Then you have a very efficient swerving decision. Yeah, but on the other hand, you might get a distortion when it comes to the adoption of the AV, and then those who don't adopt the AV, they forgo the safety advantage of the AV. Yeah. And so in our simple setup, that boils down to a choice between two regimes for the regulator. So one thing is to say, okay, I really want everyone on board, everyone adopt the AV. That means I, in particular, must get the guy with the high adoption costs on board. And so here I must choose a very high level of driver protection. Yeah, we call this full adaption. Yeah. And the other regime is where I could say, well, I don't want such a big distortion. Yeah, maybe it's better to get only one of the two guys on board and only have the low adoption type adopt the AV and let the other guys stick with the HV. So just to illustrate again, if you go back to this picture, so for example, if I set the level of driver protection here at this level, then both would adopt. Yeah, so that is the regime with full adoption. Yeah, if I in contrast set it in between here, then only the low type would adopt. Yeah. Okay, so just to give you the payoff functions, that full adoption then means I have to be at least as large. Sorry, go back again. I have to at least as large as this threshold value here. Yeah, and so what is my payoff then? Well, this is the probability for everyone adopts the AV. Yeah, so this is the accident probability, and this is then the harm resulting under the respective swerving decision. On the other hand, I get partial adoption, yeah, when I can set a smaller threshold, so anything in between these two, go back here, so anything in between here leads to partial adoption of the AV, and then you see for the type L will adopt it, so my expected cost will be alpha times, that's not nice, the order, so it should be alpha times p times 1 minus pi, so that is the social cost from the expected social cost from the low type who adopts the AV, and this is the social cost from the high type who does not adopt. So this guy sticks with the AV and therefore behaves according to her or his preferred swerving rule H hat. Yeah, and then we can basically characterize how the optimal choice depends on the parameters, whether you prefer full adoption, whether you prefer partial adoption. Yeah, and so here is basically a summary in a table, and where we characterize the optimal policy as a function of this safety advantage. Yeah, so in particular, we have 3 cases to consider. The first one is easy. Yeah, the first one is the case where the safety advantage of the AV is so large, yeah, that if the AV would be regulated at the exposed efficient level H tilde F, then both types would adopt it. Yeah, in this case, there is no trade-off between ex ante and ex post efficiency. Yeah, so the regulator sets, of course, this level, and both types adopt it, and everyone is happy. Yeah, so this is basically the case, if I show it here, when the HF here is basically, for example, here in between these two thresholds here. Yeah, in this case, we are in case 1. Yeah. On the other hand, if we are in an intermediate range of AV safety advantage, yeah, if the regulator chooses the ex post efficient level, yeah, then of the ex post efficient swerving behavior, then only the low type would adopt the AV. Yeah, and then there's basically a choice. Either I go for full adoption, yeah, then I have to distort the exposed swerving decision. Then I have a loss in terms of ex post efficiency in order to get everyone on board. Yeah, and so you can see this is the case where the HF is, for example, in between here. Yeah, there you can see, for example, if HF is here, yeah, then if I implement this, then the high type will not adopt. So I have 2 choices. Either I stay here and get only the low type, or I get the high type on board, and I do this by going as little to the right as necessary to get this guy on board. So it will just be regulated at H tilde H. Yeah. And in the third case, the safety advantage of the AV is so small that neither type would adopt it if it were regulated at the exposed efficient swerving behavior. So this is the case where the HF is here to the left of this lower of the 2 thresholds. Right? In this case, if you insist on the exposed efficient regulation, no one will adopt the AV, and therefore you have to go until here to get partial adoption, or you have to go all the way to go here to get full adoption. Yeah, so in both cases, you will have an inefficiently high level of driver protection, yeah, in order to get adoption incentives right. Yeah, and so intuitively, right? So this is basically a restatement, but the second part here does a little bit of comparative statics. So intuitively, when would you want to do partial adoption? Well, partial adoption you would do when you you have a high weight on the low types. Yeah, you have many low adoption cost drivers, so it doesn't pay off to have a huge distortion in the swerving behavior just to get these few high types also on board. Yeah, in this case, you would have a distortion which is not very high compared to the ex-post efficient regulation. While if you have a high probability mass on the high type, you really want to have full adoption. Yeah, and then you are willing to have the larger distortion. Yeah, and for the comparative statics results for the AV safety advantage and also for the driver's social preferences, then it is getting ambiguous because while you have to it depends on which in these cases you are, and there are typically also countervailing effects when it comes to the theta. Yeah, so with respect to this alpha, it is clear cut, but with respect to the other variables, it's a little bit more. It's ambiguous because there are countervailing effects. Yeah. And so another question we could ask is, what is the relationship between AV safety and the optimal level of AV driver protection? So if the AV becomes safer, does this increase or decrease the second best optimal level of driver protection? Yeah, and it is also here there are countervailing effects. So the first thing is, suppose we stay in the same regime. Yeah, so suppose we stay, say, in regime 2, then we either choose, or say we have, yeah, so then if you want to go for full adoption, we stay with this threshold, and this, I told you before, is decreasing in theta. Yeah, so if, excuse me, in decreasing in pi. So if the AV becomes safer and the pi goes up, yeah, then this threshold here goes down. So a safer AV leads to a lower level of driver protection. Yeah. On the other hand, for example, when I'm here in this case 3, and I increase the level of AV safety, then I might get a jump, yeah, from partial adoption to full adoption, and then actually the level of AV driver protection increases. So I might be here because I prefer partial adoption initially, but as the pi increases, I might prefer now the higher threshold because I want to have everyone on board, because it's now more important to have everyone on board because the safety advantage of the AV increases, and that might lead to an increase in the level of driver protection. Yeah, so that is also their countervailing effects, and I think our analysis somehow fleshes this out nicely. Yeah. So I have a numerical example here just to illustrate the point. So in the left panel, we have the case where alpha is low. So there's a low probability for the low type. Yeah, so I have many high cost types here. Yeah, I have many types who are reluctant to adopt the AV. Yeah, and therefore I want to have them on board. So full adoption is really important. Yeah. So, and this means that the social cost with full adoption is lower than the social cost with partial adoption throughout. Yeah. And here it is clear when the pi increases, then also the degree of driver protection decreases. Yeah. But on the other hand, when the alpha is high, so when I have a lot of low adoption cost types, yeah, then I have a range where partial adoption is attractive. Yeah, I don't want everyone on board. I don't want the big distortion exposed. I just want the small distortion. Here you see there's a range where partial adoption is optimal. So here in case 2, the optimal policy is here to not distort for this type, yeah, HF in case 2. But then at some point I switch to full adoption because the social costs are smaller, and then I jump up to H tilde H, and then have an increase, and then as the pi increases even further, I again get a decrease. So here I get a non-monotone effect of pi. So for this reason, the relationship between the AV safety and the optimal regulation in terms of the swerving behavior is ambiguous. Okay, so in the baseline model, we have assumed that the probability of an accident is exogenously given by P. Yeah? We have also looked at the model extension where we do make the pedestrian an active party, namely one who can choose a care level which affects the likelihood of an accident. So in particular, this P is now a P of X, and X is the care level taken by the pedestrian. Yeah, and so the accident probability with the HV is then P of X, and the accident likelihood of the HV is then P of X times 1 minus pi. Yeah, and the cost of taking care is tau X, so tau is the constant marginal cost of taking care. Yeah. And so I think this brings in a new interesting perspective, because now we have basically a party whose care level determines the probability of an accident. Yeah, and this is intertwined with the incentives of the other party to decide which vehicle to prefer, and it is intertwined with the decision of the regulator how much driver protection to implement in the AV. Yeah. So let me just briefly walk through you through that. So is that clear? The expected cost of the pedestrian, it is the cost of effort. And then this is SA is the market share, so to say, of the AV. Yeah, depends. When it's full adoption, then we have a market share of 1. When it's partial adoption, we have a market share of alpha. And then this is basically the respective swerving behavior for the for the HV, this is the H hat. And for the AV here, it is the H tilde. I fear you can't see this very clearly, but I tell you. Yeah. And so if you go through these different stages, so if you look at the optimal effort choice of the agent, I mean, it is interesting. Of the pedestrian, it is clear that the optimal effort increases with the level of driver protection of the AV, right? This is natural. If the AV protects the driver more, then this is bad news for the pedestrian. Yeah, because when the driver is protected more, the AV will swerve less often. Yeah, and this gives an incentive for the pedestrian to exert more effort, to reduce the likelihood of an accident. Yeah. On the other hand, as the AV becomes safer, or as there are more AVs on the streets, yeah, the likelihood of meeting an AV increases. Yeah, that is good news for the pedestrian, because it reduces the expected harm of the pedestrian. Yeah, and therefore the pedestrian responds with lower effort. Yeah. And so if you now build this in the adoption choice of the driver, yeah, you have basically the same formula, except that you have, instead of the P, you have now the P of X star. X star is the optimal effort of the pedestrian. Yeah, and our point is now to say that as the effort becomes more costly for the pedestrian, yeah, this makes the AV more attractive for the driver. Yeah. So the mechanism is here that the higher tau, which is the marginal cost of exerting effort or exerting care for the pedestrian, if that increases, then the pedestrian is less willing to take care. Yeah. And therefore, the accident occurs with a higher probability, and therefore this makes the AV more attractive for the driver. Yeah, because it strengthens basically the safety advantage of the AV. Yeah, and finally, at the first stage, I think we find an interesting result is that even if you fix the adoption decision, yeah, the pedestrian care provides now a second incentive for the regulator to choose a level of driver protection which is higher than the ex-post optimal one. Yeah, why is that? Because by setting the AV level, the level of AV driver protection high, as I have just shown you, this fosters incentives to take care by other road users, such as pedestrians. Yeah? So I can trigger more effort by other road users if I push up the level of AV driver protection. Yeah? So then in this sense, we have basically identified two sources why you might basically go beyond the socially at ex-post efficient level to trigger adoption of the AV and to trigger effort or care incentives by other road users. Okay, so that's a question. I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Yeah. Ronald?
I'm confused. I mean, the higher the protection, the higher the AV, the more the pedestrian is going to be reckless, no? Isn't it the reverse of what you just said?
No, no, it's not because your statement, I think, is not correct in our model. The higher the AV the level of driver protection of the AV, this is bad news.
Oh, the driver protection. I see.
Yeah, it is driver protection, right? So the AV protects the driver, and that means the AV will swerve less often, and therefore the pedestrian will be harmed more often, and therefore the pedestrian has an incentive to exert more effort to avoid accidents in the first place.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so to summarize, so this was about AV behavior in moral dilemma situations, which according to some studies we have seen basically are important drivers for AV acceptance and adoption. And as economists, we had the idea that this could be thought of as a trade-off between ex ante and ex post efficiency, but we are not the only ones to look at this kind of trade-offs. There are a few thousands examples where there's a trade-off between ex post and ex ante efficiency, but I think we are the first to do this in this particular setting. And what we find is basically that the optimal regulation for AVs to behave in such dilemma-like situations is even if you are a utilitarian regulator, you should not regulate the swerving behavior in a utilitarian way, but you should basically give more protection to drivers. You do this to foster adoption incentives, and you do this to also foster the care incentives of third parties, of other road users. And I think the model is I mean, of course, it is not the whole story. We are not claiming this, but I think it gives us a useful framework in terms of thinking about these issues. And also we think that our comparative statics properties here, they are very intuitive and so on. We have not assumed any crazy stuff here, and the assumptions are kind of natural, maybe too simplistic. Of course, we can discuss that, but the trade-off itself, I think it's pretty clear. So if I have time, I would like to just have one more slide, if that is okay. So we looked at so how this fits, for example, other views or policy views on AVs, and we came up with a report for the European Commission, which basically stresses that the regulation of AVs should adhere to what they call a fundamental principle of fairness, which requires that no subgroup should be more vulnerable with AVs than with HVs. And we think that might give rise to a trade-off which is related to the one we are basically analyzing, because exposed it might be optimal to harm vulnerable subgroups, right? And you might even want to distort in a direction of doing that, because you have this ex ante aim of getting people to adopt these kind of vehicles in the first place. So that might be maybe also a valuable contribution we have, because it helps you. The kind of trade-off is very similar to this issue of fairness considerations. Okay, so that was all I have to say. Actually, I didn't know whether I've exhausted the time framework or whether I was going too long, but no one stopped me, so I think it is just okay. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss more.
Super. Thank you very much for this very clear talk and topic. So, is there anyone who has any further questions, any further discussion? Evgenia.
Yeah, hi. I have actually two things to say. So the first thing, maybe it's my personal driving experience, and I never had a major accidents, but quite a lot of, near accident situation, but they never included such a moral dilemma. Half of them were only danger for myself and passengers in my car, like driving against the tree, or it was me not noticing bicycle driver at the time, but it was, I always could prevent the accident without any possibility harm for myself, which means that if you really make a model where IV can reduce the probability of accident, I would say at least my decision would be that the art of accidents with this trolley dilemma, moral dilemma you speak about, would be very small percentage of any possible accident which could happen. So when I will take a decision to buy IV or heavy car, or as someone proposed to buy a car with both options, but to switch them, I would really mostly think about IV preventing any other possible kind of accidents, and not only, one where I have to decide either me or someone on the road. Yeah, so this was the first thing I wanted to notice. And the second thing, if we will go to the practice of really adopting IV, I think it would be really a case for a lot of bound attentionality models, and not necessarily the rational framework. So the people will act, I don't know, according to Knighton uncertainty model. They will calculate the probability wrong, and so on. So this is what I think would be, in the end, of what would influence the decision of people to buy or not to buy IV car, or to switch the regimes if you have both options in one car.
Okay, thank you very much for your two comments. So as for the first comment, I fully agree that the sort of accidents we model here are certainly not the most prevalent sorts of dangerous situations or accidents. In fact, what I can say is that there's this literature where people say that this is something which people care a lot about, even if it is unlikely, because it has very dramatic consequences. And it has triggered a considerable discussion. But there's also arguments by practitioners, for example, saying, like you are saying, come on, this is all very unlikely, and that should not be an important driver for people's decisions, right? So all I can say here, well, I can say two more things, right? First of all, our trade-off is not confined now to these extreme situations of these life or death decisions, which may be rare for accidental situations, but I mean, you don't dispute that such situations can arise. Luckily, you haven't encountered
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I think our model also applies to all kinds of situations where the exposed behavior of the AV is not what you like. So, for example, how slowly it drives under adverse weather conditions or something like that.
Okay.
You also you would say, come on, it is how defensively to drive when we go to a crossing. Yeah, if it always yields because it's very conservative, might be the exposed efficient thing to do, but you as a driver, as a consumer, you don't like that very much because you think I stand there forever because
Okay.
yes,
Yes,
so
of
this
course.
gives rise to a very similar kind of trade.
Yeah, but then, of course, this is quite different consideration. And then again, there is quite a lot of situation where I suppose I didn't like my decision as a driver as well.
Yeah,
And
of course. Of
so
course.
this
I
is
think
the assumption that such a
brings me.
situation driver can decide what is optimal for him and don't care about pedestrian. I'm afraid that my decision will be worse for everyone.
Yeah. So that I think that goes to the second question. So at this point, we have basically one type of uncertainty which relates to the harm of the third party. And this uncertainty is resolved before the swerving decision is taken. And I fully agree that it might be more realistic to assume that before the swerving decision is taken, maybe you get a signal about the distribution of harms, what situations could arise when you now go straight or when you swerve. There's still uncertainty at the time where the swerving decision is taken.
Okay.
Yeah. So in our setting with risk neutrality and rationality, that would not be a problem. So you could easily interpret H as the expected value from swerving and not swerving. And as I also think, I mean, you mentioned a framework of night and uncertainty and so on. I think you could have a behavioral
Actually,
model.
I thought about it. You actually not an uncertainty now. Even the probability of such accidents is minimal. People still take a decision based on that because they just increase probability of the worst case which can happen, me against some children on the street.
So of course it will then depend on the
distribution.
If it is a distribution, the age is another. So you have a double expectation here. You have an expectation over distributions, right? Then, of course, if you have a huge probability mass on a low harm, or so that of course will affect the behavior, and not only the first moment, like in the risk neutrality framework, right? And of course, the higher moments will also play a role. I agree. But for us, that would be the second step, basically, right? So I think it's kind of natural to start with the simplest framework and then maybe go on to extending this. But yes, I agree. I mean, that is probably not a perfect description of what happens out there. I agree.
So, other questions or remarks? Andreas, you raised your hand.
Can we make the situation even more drastic? Suppose the pedestrians are small kids coming from the kindergarten and crossing the road and want to cross the road. And the driver is more or less an old person, unable to see correctly. So it all depends on the technology of the AV. Would you stay to your statement, to your proposition that swerving is actually less preferable? So you want to protect the old person close to dying anyway in front of the kids. What would you say with respect to the probabilities then? Shouldn't you protect the kids as much as possible because the person in the car, it might be an SUV, an extremely expensive car, because only those cars are equipped with the technology of AV in the beginning, before the spreading, and all the other cars, they may have low technology of AV protection in that way. So shouldn't you be able to, what you did for the pedestrian, the care level in those cars. And then we want to rediscuss your excellent paper, and it's very, very fascinating. I really congratulate you to the proposal, but I think there's more in it.
Yeah. So as to your first question, I think you could somehow deal with the fact that the driver is very old and the pedestrians are very young and have their whole life ahead of them. That's kind of a rescaling of this distribution of the age, right? So in the sense, put that perspective in, you would basically scale up the age. Because for any given decision, the pedestrian harm just now gets higher by the mere fact that the pedestrian is very young.
Yeah, but I think, may I interrupt for a second? I didn't want to ask right in the beginning, but you were talking of the probability of an accident, and I guess you actually mean the probability of death, so that the person might die instead of being harmed. So the probability of the collusion might be very different.
No, I'm not need that someone dies. So that is just
at least your picture crossed out the person.
That is right.
So I
that is right.
thought, they are dying due to the accident. It is not, they're just breaking whatever, an arm or so.
You are right. The empirical literature, which uses that more a machine, they basically talk about sacrificing lives and so on. That is right. But I think our model does not rely on that at all. So that is why that is not the point of we have this age. I'm not in the position to quantify how valuable a life here is. We just, as is usual also in law and economics, when there are accidents, you have harms associated with that, and there might be smaller or bigger harms, might be injuries and things like that. And also the driver does not necessarily die when swerving, right? He damages his car and also damages his health, and that adds up to some damage, which we normalize to 1, basically. But we don't need for our story that someone dies here. But maybe if I may say that, so the study I mentioned in this paper by Bonfont et al., they have also asked people, what if you're not alone in the car, but if you have a family with you in the car? Yeah, and what they say is surprising, that people insist on their thinking that the AVs should behave in a utilitarian way. So it is clear when they have family and friends in addition in the car, that somehow you have a little bit lower preference for the moral rightness of a utilitarian approach. Yeah, you have a little bit more doubts, but the picture looks pretty much the same. But I mean, if you look at the study, I think there's more to be done. This is not yet a perfect study, and they have done various other things in that with that more machine framework. But this is what comes out of this empirical, and it's not incentivized. I mean that all the criticisms you have against unincentivized experiments. I mean, you ask questions like, how much do you like that? yeah, you can now allocate 100 points to this or this allocation. How much do you like it? It is not the high stakes as you will have it when you really encounter such a situation, which Evgenia fortunately has not yet encountered, and hopefully most of us have not encountered as well.
Mm.
Okay. I have a small addition to that problem, whether the situation is likely or not. Last Friday, I was in my Stammtisch and we were 10 people. And I raised the question, which was discussed today. And immediately, out of the 9 others, 6 gave a description of the case, which was here the starting point. Although they said, but they cannot imagine that ever happens the situation. They had their accidents and they had all kind of things. But so to say, as a kind of icon, of this kind of study is it was for the 6 who were no professionals, no academics even, lawyers and something like that, I mean professional lawyers. They had immediate this picture, because it's, that you have the choice between killing or harming 3, or doing something else. But in addition, what they had was, that on the left side, when you there was another car coming. You see, instead of just harming yourself, going over there, there was also, and then of course it makes it more tricky. But this was, so to say, in addition, it was very popular there.
Yeah.
So I just want to add this, how people, so to say, on the street think,
Yeah.
Of course, it's an artificial situation, but obviously maybe it's too much in the newspapers, not just in literature, but also in the newspapers discussed, that people think about the situation. I wanted to add this.
Yeah. Thank you, Manfred. So this is exactly the argument made in these empirical papers who say, well, we all know this is very unlikely, but people still, they care a lot about this issue.
Yeah.
So that concurs with what your Stammtisch experience. Yes.
Okay, welcome to the Stammtisch. Ron is
Ron.
Couldn't you do it? I mean, couldn't you just use the recklessness of the driver? So the driver gets more pleasure when he drives fast. And that the trade-off is that when he drives faster, he's more likely to cause harm. And then essentially it's the same, just offhand, it seems to me it's the same model, the same argument. The trade-off is there in the same way. I'm not sure I'm right about that, but that's just what it strikes me. The other point I want to make is, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think I agree that if you feel that depending on how quickly the AV lets you drive or how strongly it interferes with your driving behavior on the street, if that is very far away from how you would like it to drive, being a swerving decision or being it let you speed when there's no other cars around, despite the rules are you are supposed to go for 50 only, but you want to go 70 because there's no other car, you want to do that, and it lets you do that you don't like, and that reduces your incentive to adopt. That gives a similar, well, basically this are not similar, basically the same kind of trade-off. You are here unhappy with a different sort of regulated behavior other than the swerving decision. You might even connect it maybe, yeah, but that would be more complicated, I think. When that's the speeding and the swerving, the height, so that would basically be a care level which you in addition have to your adoption, right? So we have looked at the care level of the third party, and we have not formally analyzed this care level of the driver, but it is clear that the care levels, they are strategic substitutes, right? So if I as a driver exert more effort, then other road users have an incentive to exert less effort. So the best response functions here, they are decreasing. Yeah.
The other question I had is,
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I mean, the regulator, sooner or later, it's going to come up fairly quickly. I don't know if you saw the New York Times Magazine this week, but on the cover is a picture of a Tesla that's been crashed, and the big article about the Tesla and Elon Musk and how safe it really is, the autonomous version. So it's a, you know, it just happens as this week's New York Times Magazine has that on the cover, the picture of the crashed autonomous vehicle.
Yeah.
But in Europe, it would have to be an EU-wide, that AV level would be an EU-wide decision. And I just wonder if you know what kind of data they have. They must have data, for example, on how reckless the people in Germany are versus the people in Italy and the people in France and so on. And you can imagine the different countries wanting to set different standards. I can see the whole conflict coming right now.
That is a very good point. That is a very good point, because regulation will have to be at a larger entity, and there might be regional, even within Germany, I would say there will be a difference between the Protestant North and the Catholic South.
But it's the other way around than you think.
So, I mean, with Tesla, it's kind of interesting because, I mean, they somehow claim it is autonomous, but in fact it is not, because when it gets dangerous, they say, oh, now you have to take over as a driver, right? So they're not yet at that stage. So in the EU, there's now a regulation which allows cars with a special equipment, like Mercedes has it now approved, to go up for up to 60 kilometers on motorways autonomously. And that means you are not supposed to be alert at all times and ready to take over, like it, to my knowledge, it is with Tesla, right? This is a little bit of a misnomer. They can do autonomous driving, that is right. But when it comes to a difficult situation, you must be ready to take over immediately. While in this new version, so that is, I don't know, stage 3 or 4, then that is a level 3, 4, and then that means, but you really you can check your emails while you are riding. Yeah, so that is this kind of novel regulation, but of course 60 is not very fast. But if it's going in rush hour, right? If you're going to your work during rush hour, that probably makes a difference whether you have to stick to the street and hands on the wheel and so on, or whether you can really take it easy and do something else. But I don't. So that has been just recently approved, I think last year. I don't know how many. This is very expensive. So Mercedes is, I think, the only manufacturer which offers the system, which has this approval. But I don't know what data there is already there. But this looming out there is always this issue of liability, right? So that is of course still somehow unsolved. Mercedes says, yeah, if something happens, we will take care of that, but it's not so 100% sure what that means. Yeah. But I agree that I mean in some sense it reiterates what the relevance of the paper, in a sense that will be a very important regulation decision to make, and people might feel differently. Evgenia thinks it's not very important because it's very unlikely. Manfred's Stammtisch friends, they think it is very important, and so we all have different views on how it should be regulated. But I don't think we will have different manufacturers offering different protections, right? I don't know whether this can be a competition variable, in a sense that to me it sounds like it will be the same. It will be a regulation which is binding for all manufacturers.
But in order to re-ask how realistic is all this, what we talk about here in terms of this harm level that a regulator could even define, and where then the automatism could have a kind of parameter which is programmed in, how you called it at the beginning, that with this level, the protection for the occupants is then probably higher than for people outside. This level 3 or 4 automatism of Mercedes you mentioned here. Do you know if this automatism has such a parameter? your age, Tilde?
I certainly it is not just implemented in such a simple way, but it will have something programmed in how to behave in difficult situations. I mean, it must have.
I mean, for me, all this is very fantastic, yes, but really fantastic also in the way that it is very theoretical. And I'm not sure if it is even in the world of very strong automatisms and autonomous vehicles, if it is very theoretical, because even the adoption topic, from my gut feeling, this protection of the occupants is coming with the vehicle, with the, it's a SUV, yeah, it's a big cabin, and you are just safe in that car, yeah. And what I demand from the automatism is, as I do it as a natural driver, is just avoiding accidents at all. Yeah, and so thinking about during almost having the accident, already calculating through where is which harm and so on. I mean, even if it is a really strong automatism, I couldn't imagine that it would be able to predict the harm level for also situations. This is very theoretical.
I mean, first of all, again, whether you have an SUV or another less safe car, that is again is a scaling of these damages. Many, of course, in theory, that wouldn't make a difference, but of course, when we would to calibrate the model or to really nail down the quantitative predictions, then you would have to worry about all this. That is right. But I mean, I'm not an engineer. I cannot exactly say how the car will reach its decision, whether it will be programmed like one threshold. So you have some, I mean, you will have a distribution of harms, obviously, right? So there will be a dangerous situation, and then there's, in our model, there's one or two possible allocations. Either you harm one guy and the other harm, and it's then at some point deterministic. But in reality, that will be a distribution of outcomes, right? So if the car swerves, then it will give rise to a distribution which somehow is favorable to the to the pedestrian, or if the car does not swerve, it gives rise to a damage distribution which is maybe more favorable to the driver. But the exact values, of course, it doesn't know. Yeah, and so it will be a weighting of maybe. I mean, also what we are also thinking of is to say maybe this algorithm also takes into account liability duties for the company, because at the end, I mean, so yeah, that would be also an aspect to consider, right? Not just the mere decision that harming the driver or harming the pedestrian.
Yeah, very interesting, the whole topic. Is there any other remark or question around? So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was really very interesting.
Great discussion, and thanks for your attention. Thanks for having me.
Yep.
I enjoyed it a lot.
Super. Thank you very much.